Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is U.S. Navy Captain retired Dr. Fred McLaren. He served 26 years in the U.S. Navy and is a veteran of the Cold War. And sir, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Let's start at the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born at Lake Arrowhead, California. I was a divorce in the family. Let me just put it this way, that I ended up going to 21 grammar schools and junior high schools and 6 high schools, including a year and 3/4 in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So when somebody asks me, where am I from, I have to stop and think now and then. But basically, I'm a 9th generation Californian. On my mother and my birth father's side were the first Spanish explorers of California.
Well, I don't know if you were in a military family. It sounds like you probably, were you?
Yes, we have a military tradition that goes back over 400 years. Interestingly enough, Irish, Scots, Spanish, Italian, we're all fighting the British.
And so at what point did you decide you wanted to join the military?
We had a funny family tradition. At age 5, my cousins and I, this is California, and our Spanish is our second language or first language. My maternal grandmother and mother both explained to me what the family tradition was, and of course my other choice was I could become a Catholic priest. And at age 5 we were started on horseback riding lessons. We were jumping by the age of 6. We were the first generation not to have fencing. We had boxing. And then to our utter disgust at 6 we had dancing lessons, which I look back would have been for grace and balance. So I think I always intended to go in the military.
And you initially went to Southern Cal on an ROTC, correct?
UCLA.
Oh, UCLA, okay.
UCLA, but I was nothing but a jock there. And that was funny. It was a beautiful golden year. And but I realized I was in a football fraternity and I was social chairman of the fraternity as soon as I became active, that things were going downhill. And I moved heaven and earth to get into the Naval Academy so I could develop the self-discipline to get through life. Now, one of the dumbest things I did in late January of '51 with 2 other football players, we played freshman football. We got bored. We signed up to join the French Foreign Legion. And my father was on there in Los Angeles, Consul General. I don't know if they're still there now, but my father was active duty military up in Inyo, Kern, California. And I think I got rattled on by some fraternity brothers. He caught me just a shade less than 4 hours before I was off to Paris and God knows what. But I got into the Naval Academy, in July of '51. But
How did you arrange that, given your exploits in California?
How did I arrange what?
How did you get into the Naval Academy?
Well, at least I made good grades, and I was a high school's only 4-sport letterman, and then I was president of several clubs. And so I guess I was glib enough to talk myself into it. I got Senator Nolan's appointment. Took a competitive examination. I was lucky enough to, my alternate myself got the appointments.
And what was life like for you at Annapolis?
I hated every minute of it. It was like going from UCLA, it was like committing myself to Sing Sing for 4 years. And I did my share of rebelling. I came within an inch of getting kicked out on conduct, all small things my first year. And strangely enough, during my second class or junior year, I came within very close to getting kicked out on conduct again, and I have no idea what was the matter then because I was already starting to make good grades and everything else. But what was I fighting against? Of course, was being hammered into that mold. I wanted to preserve my independence and independent thinking, which thank God I did because it helped out later as a submariner.
So how would you describe yourself upon graduation as compared to when you entered?
Relieved, vastly relieved. I was getting a decent pay and I was free of the academy and all the restrictions and regulations. And it was a delightful day. Of course, I was idiot enough to get married within a week.
Busy time.
Yeah.
What was your first commission?
Well, as an ensign, and back in those days, I was off for a destroyer. Now, but that's not why I entered the Naval Academy. I wanted to be a Marine pilot, and unfortunately I failed the eye physical. My last year was just 2025, and I'd already bought my uniforms, Marine Sword, and they promised me, okay, you'll go into Marine Recon, jump school and all that. And then out of the blue, the Secretary of Defense mandated that West Point, the Naval Academy, send 25% of their graduates into the Air Force, because the Air Force Academy hadn't graduated its first class. And then another week later, another 5%. So suddenly all of us that thought we were going in the Marine Corps elsewhere ended up filling all these empty Navy billets.
So where did you go?
I went to the destroyer Gregory out of San Diego, which turned out to be perfect because I got responsibility very early. And in those days, you couldn't apply for submarines or underwater demolition team or anything like that until you'd served in the fleet a couple of years. And for submarines, hopefully qualified as officer of the deck and fast carrier task force, so, which I did. Quemoy situation, Taiwan patrol, the whole works. Just as a young officer, I got a full department, a gunnery department. And then when the 2 years came along, I applied for both underwater demolition team, which became SEALs, and submarines. Got selected for both, passed the physicals for both, agonized for about a month, and went submarines.
Why did you choose subs?
Well, my father did a lot. He, at that time, headed the gunfire sports school, and they had the SEAL teams, underwater demolition team, under him. I mean, he didn't go swimming with them or anything like that, just an administrative thing, but he was worried I was going to become a beach bum, and there was no career pattern. Otherwise, I'd have gone UDT and SEALs. I have to look back now, Greg, and chuckle, because what was the matter with, I was a surfer too. What's the matter with being a 23-year-old beach bum on full pay? I might have made the wrong choice, but it turned out to be the right, submarines really turned out to be perfect for me.
Really a life-changing decision.
Yeah. I made several life-changing decisions, or I had them visited on me.
Was it an immediate confirmation that you'd made the right choice, or did it take a while?
It took a while. Yeah, no, and all the time, I think all through life you evaluate and reevaluate, but I've never hesitated to jump, tighten my belt, or no matter how convenient, when it really looks like a smart thing to do.
1959, I believe it was, you're selected by Hyman Rickover.
Right, I was among the first 50. And it was, that's interesting because I didn't expect to be called back for an interview. And I got a message just 5 days before I'm supposed to go back there, and everybody else had, of course, gotten a little bit of time. And before you go back with him, all I could think of is, God, how do I prepare for this? Because I always wanted to go nuclear submarines, but I hadn't even qualified in submarines yet. And so as far as I know, I'm the only submariner that was called back and accepted before they'd gotten their dolphins. Anyway, I had sense enough to get a physics book and to read the book, The Atomic Submarine and Admiral Rickover. Read them both thoroughly, and I did very poorly when his 4 staff members interviewed me before I met him. But there was one of them, a Commander Crawford, who said, "Oh, you reviewed a physics book?" And I said, "Yes, sir." With that, he pulled out a drawer, and here's all these physics books. Which one was it? Thank God I was telling the truth. And I said, "Well, it's that one." So we pulled it out, and we went through that chapter by chapter as he asked me questions for the next hour and a half.
Oh.
I think that was the only upcheck. Then I got into the interview with Admiral Rickover the next day, and he was sort of, I think, about 30 feet away, tiny man, but those blue eyes are boring into you. And I walk in there, and I'm the only one from 7 from Pearl Harbor that sat down in the chair with part of a leg cut off, but I must have sat so rigidly I never noticed it. And the first thing the Admiral said to me, "What are you, a wrestler?" I said, "Sir?" He said, "Yeah, you have cauliflower ears." Well, I was thinner, and and certainly in the years before, I was pretty sensitive the way my ears stuck out. So he did the perfect thing. He really hit my adrenaline button. And then the next thing he said to me, he waved his hand dismissal. He said, well, my people have examined you and you're stupid and lazy and we can't use you. Well, I was really up then, and so for the life of me, I can't remember whether I argued I wasn't stupid or I wasn't lazy. But I gave him chapter and verse for about the next 3 to 5 minutes. Meanwhile, secretaries are coming in, grabbing my sleeve, trying to get me out of there. But I had my say, went out, and then his deputy, Captain Dunford, who had been very formal with me before. I thought, God, that's a horrible interview. And of course, one of those interviewers was Dr. Panoff. I'm not sure we were ever speaking the same language. Everything he said to me could have been in Basque. I didn't understand a word of it. And so Captain Dunford said, called me Lieutenant McLaren, very formal. As I walk out, Admiral Rickover, he says to me, hey, Mac, come in here. So I go in there, all of a sudden it's become informal. He said, well, he'd been listening to the interview. He said, well, that was quite a performance. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, I can tell you one thing. You stood at the top or the bottom of the 7 that have come in from Pearl Harbor today. And he said, that's all I can tell you. Well, I got to the Ambassador Hotel in Washington, and there was already a message that I'd been accepted. And I learned from that time, of course, that you had to stand, well, I would do that with anybody. You had to stand your ground with Admiral Rickover or anybody else.
What a story.
Yeah.
So that really started
Well, the
things.
chips are right on the table there, you know. I could have blown that.
He wasn't going to forget you anytime soon.
No, he didn't either.
We'll take a quick break. More with retired U.S. Navy Captain Dr. Fred McLaren right after this on Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Navy Captain Fred McLaren, Dr. Fred McLaren as well. Served 26 years in the U.S. Navy, and sir, just before the break, you were telling an amazing story about how you first interacted with Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, of course,
Right.
and how what appeared to be a disastrous interview turned into you being chosen for a select unit. Where did you go from there?
Well, I went to my, from there you go to nuclear power school. It's 6 months academic. At that time it was in New London, Connecticut. They call it the Advanced Nuclear Power School. And I was among the first 50. So, you know, when we arrived there, God, we were treated like astronauts. You know, we were heroes of the submarine force and wined and dined and all that. But the academics were intense. In the first 2 weeks, you covered everything you'd covered in college as far as math or physics, and certainly high school. And then you went on from there with all the special mathematics and physics involving nuclear reactors. And final graduation problem was designing a reactor. They gave you certain specifications, and you had to come up with a good, I wouldn't say marketable design, but it was a great concept. Attrition rate was probably about 1 in 4. And then from there I went up to the land-based prototype at West Milton, New York, the S3G plant. It was General Electric. And we had to qualify from every position, finally finish after the end of about 5 to 6 months as the chief operator of the whole thing. And that was about June of '60. And then I was lucky enough to get orders to the USS Sea Dragon, SSN 584, which in about a month and a half was going to be the first nuclear submarine to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, its new home port by the North Pole. And so that was fantastic. And en route, we were the first and only submarine to spend a week looking at the underside of icebergs. We surveyed for the first time in history the entire Northwest Passage. And then we went to the North Pole, and we played, one of the things we did, we played the first game of baseball at the North Pole. The pitcher's mound was situated our closest estimate of the North Pole, and the bases were lined up such that if you hit a home run, you circumnavigated the globe. If you hit the ball into right field, it was across the international date line into tomorrow. If the right fielder caught it, you'd throw it back in yesterday. And sliding took on new meaning. I mean, you could slide into second base, and because of the ice, go another 20, 30 feet beyond it and get tagged out. And, we divided the ship in a couple of teams, and to this day, I'm not sure what day we finished the game, much less started, considering this crossing the international date line. But that baseball's in the Baseball Hall of Fame now.
Is that right?
That was the 25th of August, 1960, yeah.
What was it like at the North Pole?
Well, to me, that's the first time I'd ever been up there, and it was a beautiful day. Temperature was pleasant. I would say probably about somewhere close to 40 degrees, and of course we're all worried about polar bears across, because as the saying goes, you can't see them until they open their mouths. And there were some members on the crew, and we used to pull this later, that warned us that polar bear will sneak up on you with one paw over its nose and just move up on you, and then suddenly move that paw and jump on you, and they could jump as much as 20 or 30 feet. So that made us all that had never been up there before nervous. A lot of fun. We had a lot of fun up there, and we put the first scuba divers ever in the water at the North Pole.
Tell me about qualifying for submarine command.
Well, didn't start that until I went to my next submarine, the Skipjack. I had a wonderful skipper who started me on that right away. And at that time, in the early days of submarines, people like myself were trained by World War II veterans. And their procedure back in those days is you were trained basically when you started to finish the qualification, trained so that you'd be able to take command fairly early. And so there's tremendous emphasis on approach and attack, and then being able to successfully evade. So we fired a lot of torpedoes during that. And my skipper in particular, you had to make a successful evasion, even though a destroyer might have you in its sonar. That was one of the determining factors. So it was very rigorous in my time. But I qualified my first year on Skipjack, and that would have been I'd been early '63, and that meant I was qualified in command. And if it had been like World War II, I could probably expect to go as second command or command within a couple of years. But nuclear submarines, I also had to qualify formally. That was seeing Admiral Rickover again as a chief engineer. And I did that later that year, because the rule was you could not be a commanding officer unless you'd had a successful engineer's tour. Now, this is quite different to the British or any other system. They have either deck officers or engineers. But that qualifying as chief engineer is a very good thing, because then when you're commanding officer, you really have a good feel about your nuclear power plant, which incidentally was always extremely reliable. During my time, we never had any incidents or anything else. But, those were long working hours, and in those first years in nuclear submarines, there was one really hard on the family. One year, I think I was home only about 28 days out of 1 year, and another about 37.
Fred, let's pause right there.
Amazing any marriage would survive it.
Fred, let's pause right there real briefly. We'll be right back with Dr. Fred McLaren, retired U.S. Navy captain, on Veterans Chronicles. Thanks for being with us this week on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, joined in studio today by retired U.S. Navy Captain Fred McLaren. He served 26 years in the U.S. Navy. He's a veteran of the Cold War, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about for the next segment here. Fred, we kind of jumped from your commission with Admiral Rickover to sub-command training and that sort of thing. In the midst of that, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. And you were deployed during that time. Explain where you were and what you did.
Exactly. I reported to Skipjack when I was in the shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And of course, it was supposed to be in the shipyard till the end of that year. We're talking about 1962. I got there in late June. And as you well know, about September, early October, that Cuban Missile Crisis, as the whole started getting going. All of a sudden, we got word that we had to finish up in a hurry, like about 4 months early, and get things wrapped up, which we were by early October. We were out on sea trials. And as that crisis sort of approached, peak, which I think was about the third week in October, we're sent to sea, and we're supposed to go straight to the Mediterranean as fast as we can, and then go all the way to Piraeus, Greece, where our mission, I guess, would be to lie in wait for any Russian submarine or Soviet submarines or ships coming out of the Black Sea. Well, we also were well aware that at that time that the Soviet Union probably had something over 100 diesel boats, both the Whiskey and the Foxtrot class, that they could deploy and head down there. And so the trouble with Skipjack, it was the world's fastest, but it was a noisy boat. And that meant when you were running fast, you couldn't really hear anything, even though we were deep. So every time we had to slow down going across the Mediterranean, come to periscope depth to fix our position and copy a radio broadcast, we're clearing baffles and carefully listen, because we have no idea how many submarines are coming down from the north, or if they detect us, what danger it'd be to ourselves. So we'd go to battle stations, and at that time I was the fire control coordinator. We'd control everything. We always had what we called a snapshot ready in the tube. So, and the rules of engagement were quite simple. I think about that more and more. The rules of engagement were simply this: if you heard somebody else flooding a tube or opening an outer door, you fired that snapshot. And so when you're stopping to get to schedule every 8 or 12 hours, your heart's sort of in your mouth, because you're sort of going through that blind zone. Meanwhile, you're clearing baffles. Well, we never encountered anything, but we know now in retrospect that coming down and in position by, let's say, about the 20th of October, were 4 Soviet Foxtrot diesel submarines, each carrying 1 nuclear torpedo. Of course, we didn't know that till many years after the Cold War. So anyway, we went into the Mediterranean. It was a thrill. The skipper had always wanted to see the Straits of Gibraltar. We arrived just before dawn as the sun rose, and it was quite exciting to run on the surface so as not to alarm our British friends. And then we went in the Mediterranean. It was decided it would be too provocative to go all the way to Piraeus, Greece, so we went to La Spezia, Italy. And other than going out frequently to patrol and render services to our NATO allies, why, nothing else happened. We just had a hell of a lot of fun, did a lot of drinking of good wine, and it just became, it just sort of tapered off from that crisis where one of these Foxtrots almost fired a nuclear weapon, and but we didn't know anything about that. So we were back home by, we had Thanksgiving at Pompeii, and then got home before Christmas. Nothing like a big spaghetti dinner for Thanksgiving.
Sounds like a pretty good deployment to me.
Yeah. Oh, we had a lot of fun. Well, one of the fun things was I was made, you can imagine, yet we had to keep the reactor critical the whole time so we could immediately deploy. But I was lucky enough to get off a week as senior shore patrol officer in Marseille, France, or Toulon, France. And that was fantastic, So I wandered around with these police looking for any of our sailors. We didn't want them to wander off. The Algerian situation had just ended about 6 months before. Okay. And there were Algerians in that area, and we didn't want our sailors to wander in there causing any trouble. And then I'd get off at midnight, and there was a French Naval Officers Club that was open about 4 in the morning, and off I'd go. One of the best weeks I've ever spent in my life.
We're going to talk about perhaps your most significant deployment in just a moment. That's with the Queenfish nuclear attack submarine. That would be in 1969. In between, of course, hostilities are ramping up and continuing in Vietnam. What are you doing during that time?
During that time, I was on Skipjack for 3 years, and then I became the commissioning or second in command, the executive officer of it turned out to be the first of a new class of nuclear submarine, the USS Queenfish, even though we were the 9th in the class, keel was laid a year and a half after the lead ship in General Dynamics, that's a Sturgeon. We were built in Newport News, and we went to sea in 1966, 3 months before the lead ship did. And this submarine was one of 37 all capable of operating in polar regions year-round. And so what we did on that, once we completed building the submarine, going to sea, within a month of commissioning, we took her north of the Arctic Circle into the Davis Straits, Baffin Bay, and tested out all these under ice operating procedures, finally finished by surfacing through the ice. Then we headed south, and then in about a month or so, through the Panama Canal to our new home port, Pearl Harbor. I left her, and we did nothing but just sit in port for months. And I left the submarine summer of '67 and to be a student at the Naval War College. And I was only the second nuclear-trained officer to be released to go to the War College. The first being poor Captain Slatter. He was skipper of the Scorpion, which went down the following year, and on its way back from the Med. And then during the long summer of '68, they took pretty leisurely time, long periods of time off the War College. So that during the summer, I got myself assigned to a brand new nuclear attack submarine, the Greenling, and I went off on literally a 4-month deployment with her. And it was one of those super operations. I was a command watch officer, and we were in the Naval Unit Citation and Skipper Legion of Merit. Not much more I can tell you other than it was the fact of a very important and productive Cold War mission. Then I came back as an instructor at the Naval War College, the first nuclear trained officer to have that assignment. And so I was primary in war gaming department, but at that time I also won a major Armed Forces wide scholarship to do my doctorate at Brown in Chinese government politics. So alternated, my whole day was just a mess between going to Brown 3 times a week and being at in war gaming. And Admiral Rickover was very pleased, but let's see, it was about late spring of '69. All of a sudden he calls me on a late Friday afternoon about 5:30. That's one of his checks to see if you're really staying in there and working. Thank God I was there, because he called me to say I was going to be, he talked to me personally. I was going to be assigned as commanding officer of the Queenfish, the same boat I'd been with since it was a keel on. So I knew it already like the back of my hand. And even though my whole family is up there in Newport, Rhode Island, I'm supposed to report down to his headquarters about 4 or 5 days later for 3.5 months with him. And I did that, and of course that's a very intensive course. You're down with him, and during that period, you cover in detail, but you study on your own, the fluid systems, everything pertaining to the engineering plant, not just the nuclear power plant. And then you have these orals and written examinations, and the attrition rate on that was about 1 in 3. And God help you if you got sick or anything else, you had a family emergency, because that'd be the end. And then I remember we finally finished with a 7.5-hour written examination, if you can imagine that. Oh. And then you have a final session with the Admiral. And in my case, he tried to provoke me a little, but by that time I'd become a little wiser. I just kept my cool. He made some remarks about the engineering standards when I was engineer on skipjack. Well, I was pretty hot on the collar, but thank God I kept my mouth shut. And then I went on to report aboard Queenfish in September of 1969 to relieve the man I'd worked for as skipper when I was the second in command. And as he said, "Oh God, there's nothing worse than having your former exec come back and give you an administrative inspection." But it worked out well, because here I was going back to a boat that I was almost one with. I just knew every inch. I'd been responsible for writing every operating instruction, everything pertaining to operating it. and it was a perfect match. So it really set me up nicely for a very successful command tour.
Just a couple minutes before we take our next break, but start that story. What was the mission of the Queenfish?
Well, the mission of the Queenfish in war, of course, was to be deployed basically to kill other submarines. So, you know, we had the legs of nuclear power, that high speed, so we could run and go be forward based to wherever they might be emerging. And at that time, our potential enemy was the Soviet Union. And basically, we want to be in position either ahead of time or en route to catch them as they're emerging from port, because they'd be going after merchant ships and surface ships. So our primary mission was to kill other submarines.
And where were you?
Well, we're in that case, I'll say the Russian Far East. How's that?
Okay. Still classified?
Or Soviet Far East, yeah.
Okay.
And leave it to your imagination as to what bases we might be off of.
I got a feeling I know. Any hostile encounters?
No, you know, the other part of our mission in the Cold War, of course, the Cold War missions, and I think I've made over 20 of those. I don't know how many people can match that. But was reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. And as I said in my book, Silent and Unseen, I did say to gather the intelligence, you had to close within weapons range of your adversary, yours and his, silently, and gather the information you wanted as to its capabilities, whoever you're going after, and then retreat undetected, silent and unseen. And certainly during my time, I was very successful in that, never got detected. I was asked many years ago to explain it another way, and because we were so quiet, I put it this way, that when the adversary was a cat and we were the mouse, the cat never knew we were there. When the adversary was the mouse and we were the cat, the mouse never knew we were there. One of the things that helped me a lot, Greg, was, I'd gotten a .30-30 rifle when I was 12. I was given a .22 on my 7th birthday. I was living on a ranch at that time, but I was only allowed to fire off the backs of 4 horses. Anyway, I never was much interested in killing anything, but it was sure a lot of fun to ride around and shoot like the Westerns. But I got interested, maybe about age of 13, in being a bow and arrow hunter. And what was wonderful about that, you have to be quiet, blend with the environment, be successful. But to tell you the truth, I never killed anything because I was fascinated. Once you really blended in with that environment, and you got yourself attuned to the birds and the other noises, you could tell what would be passing through. Like, for instance, if there are a bunch of crows carrying on, chances are that's probably a coyote or more likely a bobcat. And so I ended up photographing animals rather than as they pass, rather than doing anything with bow and arrow. But it was a perfect setup for being a submarine captain later, because you want to blend quietly in with that environment. And no matter how super quiet they are, if nothing else, you can just pick up an adversarial submarine based on the disturbance they create among the marine life. So that whole business, about 5 years of being a bow and arrow hunter, even though I wanted to be a Marine at that time, it turned out to be absolutely invaluable.
All of your training, some of it formal, some of it informal, really.
Yeah, or accidental.
Coming together. Sir, let's pause right there. We'll come back for one last segment on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by Dr. Fred McLaren. He's also retired U.S. Navy Captain. Fred McLaren served 26 years in uniform for our country, veteran of the Cold War. And sir, we were just talking about your command of the nuclear attack submarine, the USS Queenfish. And as you look back on it, a lot of awards, Legion of Merit,
2 of them.
2 Legions of Merit, and other awards. And you were just telling me off camera about the fidelity and advancement of your crew. So what gives you the most pride from this mission?
Most pride is the success of my officers and crew that were with me and the rest of their career. I mean, as I said, all my officers got their own commands. I think 3 or 4 of them made admiral. Well, I know 4 of them did. And the main thing is of course, we were building this team, and this was not a one-man show. It really was 3 parts to be really successful with an attack submarine. The boat's got to be ready in all respects. The crew's got to be ready in all respects. The captain, and then you just have to have this near perfect melding of all 3 working together as one for common mission, on behalf of the United States of America. And so it can't be a one-person show. It's got to be a team effort. And for most of us submariners, we're a very superstitious group. That boat was alive to me, Queenfish, having seen it built, just sort of coming in. It was a lucky boat, and it literally talked to me. You could feel it in your fingers, my feet. You knew just what its aspect was. Never ever let us down. And it went on. At one time, it had the greatest number of awards in the U.S. Navy under follow-on skippers. And then, unfortunately, of course, eventually it reached, they retired a little early, about 26 years. And for all I know, I might be shaving with the steel from that boat. But I tell you, it was, I was passionate about it. Now, on my mother's side, of course, I've got a strong dose of Irish, a good quarter. And in the family, we sort of, we had a reputation for second sight. And it was only during that period when I was in command of Queenfish that I sort of spooked my crew. You just, with the ship and melding to it, somehow we were just great at anticipating things and being at the right place at the right time.
Talk about the tension for a minute of having this immense power and the responsibility of protecting as much life as possible, but also protecting life from the adversary, which had the same power.
That's a good question. Having command at that time, because when you went on a mission, you ceased to communicate. You didn't communicate until you came back, unless there was something really significant of national importance to report. So he just sort of disappeared. It was like being a warship captain several centuries before, like during the time of Nelson. And I can't say it weighed on me heavily because I knew my job, and it was just one hell of a lot of fun. And the main thing is you want to instill that in your crew as well. It was a great time. It was a fun time to be a submariner because you had the Cold War in progress, all these interesting missions. You had Vietnam on top of it. Life was not dull at all. And you'd come back in port, and particularly if you were successful, as Queenfish was lucky enough to be always successful, why, we were big heroes ashore. I will tell you something funny. Now, this was the era of Admiral Zumwalt, and he allowed beards to be worn. So I had this beautiful black beard, close crop, military crop. And to my crew, that became sort of a lucky symbol because many of the other submarine captains, they might wear them at sea, but they didn't keep them ashore, see? And so even though my superiors were not happy with me wearing a beard ashore, so long as the Chief of Naval Operations authorized it, I was going to do it. And so long as we were successful, I knew I could get away with it. But submariners have this sense of humor, which you may have picked up. And I remember the first luncheon, submarine luncheon, outdoor luncheon in Pearl Harbor I went to, and I had my beard on, and one of my good friends, the late Doc Blanchard, whose father was a World War II hero, yells across the room to me so everybody can hear, "Hey, Fred, you put your head on upside down." Well, I was pretty well bald then. And I do a lot of things. For instance, when I first took command, I did a number of things. Some that made the crew, I'd say more, some of the officers that had been with the previous captain a little unhappy. They'd just come back from deployment, and I didn't want to lose that edge they'd gotten. So having at that time 11 Cold War missions under my belt already before I took command, I kept them right up on that step and worked to improve that. But on the other hand, sent some cooks to train at the Royal Hawaiian. We went to the Seattle area, Victoria area in the late fall before we went on the first mission. Sent another cook to the Empress Hotel to learn pastries, and then finally in Hong Kong, Jimmy's Kitchen. So we always made sure we got the best possible food, the best movies, replenish our library. But I also put them on 4 hours off, 8 hours on, so it was predictable. Because with young men that age, one of the things you got to do is keep them busy. But it's also got to be worthwhile to them. So you also keep them training, but then you make things exciting and interesting. And for lack of a better term, I was a very aggressive skipper when we got out on a mission. So I can't think of any opportunities we missed as far as collecting the maximum in intelligence for the country. So anyway, the first mission was very successful. It was a Navy unit commendation mission. I got the Legion of Merit for my very first mission. But the big one coming up, which I was then able to tell my officers why, before we went, officers and crew, why success on this first mission was so important. We were in the slot to do the first ever survey of the entire Siberian continental shelf under ice, totally uncharted waters, about 3,600 nautical miles. With all the other Arctic exploration, this was a huge segment. We'd be the first submarine that summer of 1970s to survey the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, and the Chekhtev Sea. Basically, it was one of those missions where you load out, and we kept it on track, and we departed on time in early July of 1970. But we had to load out for as much as we could carry on board. I estimated maybe we could load it out for maybe 160, 180 days, because basically he was sent off on the mission, and there was no termination date. That was basically to complete the mission and return to port. Well, what we were exploring for the first time in history, and it's never been repeated by anybody else, was seeing how far under the ice we could go on the Siberian shelf. See, there's really a navigable route. And, basically charged, okay, how much is comfortable? Well, I ended up doing the survey about 20 feet above the bottom. Now, the submarine's 4,650 tons. It's 292 feet long. And we're running over a totally uncharted bottom, 20 feet, and clearing the ice about 30 feet. As you can imagine, this sort of undulates. You're navigating things in your path. And it turned out to be, of course, needless to say, very arduous. But we did all this after going to the North Pole first. And very interesting, but, for instance, in the Laptev Sea, we encountered all these icebergs everywhere. The ice was very thick, generally 100% coverage overhead, but we'd always find some open lake of water, so we'd be able to fix our position by satellite at least every day. And we got about halfway through this survey, and I remember it was the 18th of August, and all of a sudden the bosses, they hadn't heard from us in a while. And if we disappeared under that ice or got stuck, nobody'd ever it'd take global warming to ever find us again. And so all of a sudden they decided they better hear from us. So I, to my utter disgust, I dashed out to the Arctic Ocean, because we'd forgotten to tell the Soviet Union we were doing this, and we didn't want to be rude. So we got out there, signaled we were okay, and then went back. Well, anyway, I no sooner got out in the Arctic Ocean, we found an open lake of water at Polinia, put up the periscope. I had made only one revolution around, and 30 feet away on the edge of the ice was this polar bear who immediately reared up. And it must have been about 11 feet tall. And I wish we'd had a camera mounted in the periscope, because she thought the periscope was the head of a seal coming up. So the next thing, she reared up, plunged in the water, and started swimming madly towards me. And I've got the crosshairs on her, and it fills the field of view. I've got her whole head, and then the idle thought enters my head, how on earth am I going to explain teeth marks on my periscope when I get back to port? She actually comes up and literally damn near puts her nose to the scope headwinder. Well, we got a few good pictures, and then she turns away, and then we see two cubs riding on her stern, and I have this picture of they're all looking at us. The mother's anxious to get away now, and then the last pictures are them running across the ice. They decided we were a lot bigger than anything you want to handle. Well, that was sort of a high point. It took us about a day to wind down from that, and then we started this survey of the most treacherous sea of all, is East Siberian Sea. It's just malevolent, shallow. I think the average depth throughout was 136 feet. Well, from the keel of the submarine to the top of the sail is 54 feet. So you can imagine, to get in as close as we could, we got pretty good at it, but there were sometimes the bottom would be 6 to 8 feet away, and sometimes the ice might be as much as 10 to 12 feet. And of course, we're constantly maneuvering, because sometimes you would have a pinnacle of ice come down almost to the bottom, and certainly be right at your depth. Anyway, we got about 2/3 through the East Siberian Sea, and it was grueling because the bottom was not level. It was irregular, and you might have these pingos come up or underwater mounts. But we got very proficient. I wouldn't say we got overconfident, but we were doing pretty well. We never touched the ice or touched the bottom. So it's a Sunday afternoon. Things always happen on the weekends or at nighttime. And we're watching the movie Shane. I'll never forget this. And Jack Palance is just about to get his just desserts, and the messenger of the watch comes down from the control room. Ordinarily it'd be very respectful. He grabs him by the shoulders and says, "Captain, you need to come to the control room right away." So I go up there, and I find on all our presentations, this is active sonar, special under ice piloting sonar, there's ice everywhere. What we had done is, when we were doing this survey, we sort of doubled back on ourselves, and we wandered into what I'd call an underwater garage. So probably that second bulkhead over there, the nose of the submarine is that far away. The ice is all the way to the bottom there. It's shallow. On both the port and starboard, probably no more than about a ship length or so. The ice is down to the bottom. We'd essentially wandered into an under ice garage, I call it. The ice is within 10 to 12 feet of the submarine. We're probably 3 to 4 feet, maybe in some areas 6 feet above the bottom. And there we were, hovering. We haven't touched anything. And the first thing I did, I picked up the MC, and throughout the ship, don't anybody move. They didn't want to change our aspect, didn't want to touch anything. Then I got on the sound-powered phones with the maneuvering room, the throttleman, and that submarine is a single propeller. Well, anybody that's has owned anything with single propeller know when you back, two things happen. It backs to port, and it squats. Well, this was not an option. We wanted to go exactly out, and I frankly didn't know how far we'd gotten into this. So then I got on the sound-powered phones, and I would tell the throttleman, "Give me 2 turns astern, or 3 turns." We'd back and just sort of coast, and of course the diving officer is watching that we're maintaining a neutral buoyancy. We're not getting close to the bottom, we're not getting close to the ice. Because we'd caught anything, for instance, if we'd caught our stern planes or our rudder. We had a huge rudder, about 24 feet from top to bottom. If we'd caught that on the ice, we'd have been stuck. And so we just did this, and it just seemed like an eternity, Greg, until it took us, actually quartermaster log showed that it took about an hour and a half to get out. And after that, I didn't authorize any turning past due south. We'll let somebody else explore that. No more cul-de-sacs like that. I would say that I call that the second worst experience of my life. You can ask me later what the worst was.
Well, we're almost out of time, so what's the worst?
The worst was on another mission. We came up, and we'd come up through this thick acoustic layer, abrupt, really a tremendous temperature change. Came up periscope depth, and all of a sudden there's 2 torpedoes coming our way. And these were steam torpedoes, and they were screaming, those screws, and they're coming straight at us. Well, I remember looking at some member of the crew, people white-face. Well, what do? Well, there's one, if there are war shots, you blow to the surface and hope these damn things run under you. But that wasn't an option, because there are things that we didn't want out there that we didn't want to see us. And I detected just a very slight right bearing drift. But I didn't want to present too much aspect to whoever had fired those torpedoes. So I went to the port side. Anyway, make a long story short, both torpedoes went screaming down our starboard side, one probably no more than about 10 to 15 feet away. Wow. Just went running right by us. Well, turned out we had inadvertently wandered into a submarine versus submarine exercise, and we didn't belong there. And even if these torpedoes had just had a dummy head, if they'd hit our single propeller in the appendage, that would put us in a very bad way. Anyway, we got the hell out of there. But my wife says I still dream about that and the ice garage. I mean, she says about once a month I'm giving orders and pertaining to those situations. So you might say it's something I never forgot.
I can see why it would stay with you. Harrowing to say the least. Fred, obviously we could spend a whole lot more time with you. Thank you so much for your service to our country.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for visiting with us today.
Good. The only thing you didn't get into, of course, and you wouldn't, later, of course, I've started diving Titanic with the Russians, and then I was on the team to make the 2001, 2002 to make the first manned dives to the German battleship Bismarck. And I'm talking at the University Club tonight on my 2 dives. Now I think there's probably no more than 6 or 8 of us going down to Bismarck twice.
Wow. And
then up to last November, I'll show you, Greg.
Where's that one resting?
About 370 nautical miles to the southwest of Brest, France, but I'm only 84, and up till this past November, let's see if I've got it, yeah. I was chief pilot of this. You fly it like an airplane down to 1,500 feet.
Oh, wow.
And I did the flight testing of it for the designer and builder. Oh, I was so excited about it. I test flew it for the designer and builder in the Bahamas. I'm also a pilot and instrument and aerobatic rated, and I was so excited because it was just, this thing just handles so beautifully. Just a little bit of pressure. We had a regular stick and pedals and all that. Thing is, the shoe-shaped pressure hull fits you like a glove, so there wasn't much turning around. So if you had a tendency to be claustrophobic, this claustrophobic would wipe you out. But in any case, I made a mistake coming home and telling my wife, God, if I weren't married to you, I'd marry this. Well, dumb thing to say.
That doesn't go over too well. Our guest this week has been retired U.S. Navy Captain Dr. Fred McLaren, 26 years of service for our country in the United States Navy, and he's a veteran of the Cold War. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.